Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Army and Navy Club in Washington, D.C., where we have attended the Atlantic Council's Commander Series, where the Chief of Staff of the United States Army, General Milley, spoke to the audience, and we're honored to have with us the 21st Secretary of the United States Army and distinguished former Congressman John McHugh. Sir, thanks very much for joining us.
Great to be with you, Vago.
I want to start off with sort of getting your take on what the chief discussed here. Obviously, an interesting strategic situation now for the Army. As he pointed out, still engaged in combat operations, whether it's in Afghanistan, whether it's in Iraq, whether it's in Syria, and elsewhere in the world where the United States Army maintains presence in some 120 odd countries. But at the same time, the nature of conflict is changing, and there's a big focus on the part of the Army to try to do that. What were some of the more interesting things you heard the chief say today?
Well, I think he made very clear the Army's working, and as the chief, he's working to try to do the old adage, repeat the mistakes of the past and fight the last war again. They're looking to the future. They're looking to the high certainties that the next war will be in a probably different place, meaning megacity, urban centers, and will likely be waged, or certainly could be waged, against a peer or near peer, where the air superiority that we've seen in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, the freedom of operations, et cetera, are far likely to be present. So you've got to think about those things. You've got to begin to train both your soldiers as well as your future leaders, your officers, to be somewhat comfortable in that very different environment. Somewhat able to execute when they don't have a very robust logistical tail behind them, when they may not always have direct communications with their higher command, and they have to make decisions on themselves. So how do they do that? How do they go about it? When do they feel they're empowered, as well as held accountable for those kinds of things? And like most things military, it takes time, and that's one of the challenges he talked about as well. That we have been in this environment for 17 plus years, depending on how you do the math, to recreate a mindset within an entire force and to retrain it to that mindset, that takes time. And so in military conflict as well, time is sometimes, maybe always, one of the most precious commodities.
Let me take you to the question of readiness. That's been a challenge. The chief has talked about readiness. All of the service chiefs have talked about readiness and building, buying back that gap. You were in the seat at the height of some of these budget challenges where you struggled fundamentally with issues of readiness, maintaining modernization programs on track. The Army obviously bled off some troops, now working to rebuild those. As you look at the Army and as you talk to your former colleagues, but also serving leaders now, how serious is the readiness crisis? And do you think that this quick patch of money that Congress is looking for, it's a $15 billion increase, a nice chunk of that is O&M money that should address some of the readiness challenges, is that going to be enough to plug the readiness hole that the Army has gotten itself into?
Well, starting with the time I was in the Pentagon, the Army has an unwritten standard for readiness of the total force, somewhere between 60 and 70%, depending on whose figures you use. At my time, we were about 34, 35% ready. That's a frightening data point for an Army that is at war and may be called on to go to even wider areas. So you try to prioritize the funding you have to meet what I think most chiefs of staff in all the services and what most service secretaries would say keeps them up at night, and that is sending troops into harm's way without the proper training, without the proper equipment. Because I know this, and I think I can speak for all the services, no matter where they're asked to go or what they're asked to do, they'll go, even though we may not have provided them that training and that equipment. And that would be a national tragedy. And it's not just some fantasy. Task Force Smith and the Korean War was very well led. Most of the officers had World War II experience. But we didn't have the time to train them, and we didn't take the resources necessary to equip them. And it was a pretty bad outcome. We don't want to repeat that. So the readiness challenge, as I said repeatedly at Posture, and all four of the chiefs that I served with repeated as well, that's probably our number one concern.
Do you think that this current slug of money, Secretary Mattis has made it clear that he wants to put readiness, get it back on the rails? All the service chiefs have said that. Do you think that this amount of money is going to be enough to start to really address some of those gaps that the Army has been facing?
The key word you used was start to address them. And the answer to your question broadly is yes. But what I worry about, because sequestration still is the proverbial law of the land, is that this is a one-time fix. And I give my former colleagues great credit. Obviously, if this were easy to turn around, it would have been turned around a number of years ago. It's not, and particularly in this political environment, it's a real challenge to find the votes and to find the right language to move forward. So it looks like they've done that. Kudos, and that will be a good first start. But again, as I said during my posture hearings, it's not just a matter of money. I told senators that, you can write a sufficiently large check, but I just can't buy readiness. It takes years to rebuild the kind of readiness that we have consumed over the last 17 or so years. So the money has to continue at reasonable levels so that the readiness challenge can be taken on 1 year by 1 year by 1 year. The oversight committees, the chairman, ranking members, they all get that. Sometimes it's hard to communicate that to the entire Congress.
How do you respond to those who say that the military services themselves have sort of exacerbated the problem? And I was talking to one very prominent analyst who has military experience. He's a graybeard. He's a key observer. And his take was, hey, listen, they're not even spending all the readiness money that they've been getting every year. So, this is an artificially constructed challenge for the services to then be able to argue for more money. I know you're grinning on that. How do you respond to those? But that's not an isolated view. I've heard members have even said that to me. How do you respond to that kind of thinking? That the services could do a better job with what they've got, in this particular challenge?
You can always do better with what you've got, and that's generally true for families. It's certainly true for federal government, and absolutely the military departments, and certainly the Army. And you always strive to do that. I don't know the particulars of that accusation. Are there ways in which we can improve readiness with the monies currently available? There probably are, but I would remind whomever said that we've taken some pretty radical steps to try to support readiness and try to support the men and women in uniform that are so critical to the Army equation. R&D has dropped. Major acquisition programs have either been canceled or put aside. That's one of those pay me now or pay me later kinds of realities that when 2025, 2030 gets here, I'm afraid, and there's still time to fix it, but I'm afraid that qualitative edge, as well as quantitative edge, really, that the United States military, certainly Army, has enjoyed on the battlefield, won't be there. As we see our peer, or certainly near peer, countries begin to close the technology gap, as we begin to see even non-state actors begin to acquire high-tech communication systems, robotics, UAVs. We've got to be concerned about that, and the R&D, the seed corn of that next platform, that next thing that keeps soldiers safe, is being left by the sidelines right now. So we can always be better, absolutely. We worked hard to try to get better, and I'm sure there's room for progress still.
Let me take you to the question of advice for the new incoming team. Where there was one nominee, Vinnie Viola, he backed out. Mr. Green now is the nominee, but there is some talk that he may be stepping aside also. But this administration is facing some of the same sorts of challenges, the same sort of geostrategic issues. You were dealing with regular briefings on what was happening on the Korean Peninsula throughout your tenure as well. Now, obviously, it's another hot button topic. But talk to us a little bit about some of your recommendations for the person who's going to fill your seat on what some of the priorities should be, what some of the to-do items will be, and what some of the trade-offs may be necessary. Because at first there was a lot of enthusiasm that there was going to be another Reagan-style buildup. That's looking like it's less likely politically and financially at the moment. Mm-hmm. So what, if you were prioritizing, so what's the advice and what are the priorities that you would recommend in this environment that we're in?
Well, the first thing I would tell to any secretary is shut up and listen, at least for a while. I had 17 years on the House Armed Services Committee, was the ranking member, honored to be so when I went to the Pentagon. And I thought I certainly knew the language of the Army and the military and knew a lot about their programs, and I certainly knew something, but I didn't know enough. And that learning gap, even for those nominees who may have served in uniform, it will be significant. And to make yourself the most effective leader you can be, you need to understand those kinds of things. One of the ways I did that is for the Army, there's a single door between the Army Chief of Staff and the Secretary's office. All kinds of urban legends. However, some years there were bookcases in front of the doors and nails in them. I don't know if any was that was true, but for all four of the chiefs that I served alongside, that door was both unlocked and used often. And while under law, service secretaries have the sufficient authorities to run the military, any service secretary that kind of shuts aside his or her chief, I think, needs to rethink that very seriously. The priorities are stated in law for a service secretary: man, train, and equip the force. And if you think about what that means, it means preparing your force to go to war. Goes back to my earlier comment, it's probably the most important and in some dimensions the most frightening thing you do, so that you've got to prioritize that. Beyond that, if you're fortunate enough to have any dollars left over, you've got to take care of the families, because this is a married force of today by and large, and it's hard enough to send a soldier forward into harm's way. They're always going to worry about their family, but you don't want to give them reasons to be, substantially worried. They want to know there's a good school for their children to go to. The health care is there, MWR programs, whatever it may be, because without that, you lose a soldier. Without a soldier, you lose your force. The next priority for me, if we possibly could get enough money to make it meaningful, is to either keep up the R&D or be very selective on that next developmental program. Learn the lessons of failures of past developmental programs, take some of the, I think, good acquisition advances and programs and policies that were implemented over the last, say, 5 or 6 years, and start preparing for that 2030 fight.
You, when you were in the seat, Secretary Mattis has restarted a drive for more efficiencies, ongoing challenge. I think that every single administration going back to George Washington's has been looking to figure out, how do you get efficiencies. But to the Obama administration's credit, there was that formal effort that you guys engaged in where everybody was going around with gigantic binders to try to figure out where to save money, what are some things that can be done. Now stepping back and looking at it, where do you think efficiencies can be had? Or is this sort of a great talking point, but that ultimately there's always a trade-off and a piper to pay downstream, that when you make some of these cuts, you don't have the bodies when you may need them downstream, because the reason for the military is not necessarily efficiency, but efficacy.
Yeah. Well, it kind of goes back to what we said about you can always do better with your readiness dollars. You can always do better with your administrative dollars as well. And you're right, most 4 secretaries of defense that I had the honor of serving with all did their own efficiency review. Bob Gates, I think, was particularly regimented about it and perhaps was particularly successful. But I think Secretary Mattis is absolutely right in saying, okay, new day, new leadership, let's take a new look. I would hope they'd go back to some of the volumes of work, those notebooks that you mentioned, and go through them, not to have to spend a lot of time recreating the wheel, but also to matching it up against what it says on the paper in those books versus what the reality of today is. My experience was, you've got to be very careful with drawing down your particularly civilian personnel, but obviously military as well. You can't go to war without them. Whether it's in the Pentagon or in the depots and in the arsenals and out doing the shipbuilding, these folks make the military services run. So you can always do at least the same with less. I don't know about more, but you can do the same with less if you're precise about where the cuts come from. I think it's more a question of organizational structure. You create a new office, understandably, human nature. People in that office are going to work real hard to make themselves valid and to justify their existence. So that often means more downstream work that may or may not have value. So you need to look at your boxes on your organizational chart, particularly from OSD. I heard a lot of people complain over the years that worked for me, and I know the other services felt that the services folks were very constrained in where they could go and what they could do, and a lot of the work they were doing was highly duplicative as it came down from the OSD side of the equation and from the Joint Chiefs side. So you got to kind of look at those things. Jim Mattis, I had the honor of serving with him when we had all the combatant commanders in and listening to him. He's an extraordinarily gifted, extraordinarily bright guy, and I have no doubt he'll work this hard.
Let me ask you two last questions because I know your time is short. First, your former colleague Adam Smith was at a recent conference, and the point that he made is that he was talking about fiscal reality. He said that when you get the member of Congress pin, you don't get a magic. It was a great Adam Smith line. You don't get a magic wand. You have to deal with fiscal reality. And he said that there are people who are living in fiscal la-la land. That if you look at where receipts are, the size of the deficit, that a major increase is unlikely, more unlikely than not. And so what he said is it's much better to have an army of 400,000 that's trained, ready, and equipped than an army of 600,000 that's held together with duct tape. Where do you fall on that debate? Because there are those who look at the Army and say that it gets consumed with gigantism, as one of my friends said, who's a retired colonel. What do you think that trade-off is, and is Mr. Smith sort of on the right track on that?
Well, I think he has a great point, and I don't want to get into a debate about what the right number is, 400, 420. I mean, we were on a track under congressional direction to go to 450. That's been reversed, at least for the moment. And my answer to anybody who would ask was always simply, we can have an army of one if you don't want that army to do anything. And I've heard the criticism that the Army is fixated on end strength numbers, and I think that is partially correct, but I don't think it's fully considering the reasons for that. We try to match our end strength requirements very carefully against what the national security strategy and what the realities of the moment have us doing. And a lot of what has happened to us fiscally, thus to our end strength, wasn't directed at a time when we had a Russian presence in Ukraine, didn't have the aggressive actions in the South and East China Sea by the Chinese, certainly did not have the kind of deterioration of the security situation on the Korean Peninsula. So, you've got to have that end strength to march. We're everywhere in that. I mean, there's 20,000, 28,000 military personnel on the Korean Peninsula, and everybody's kind of figuring, well, if this goes to the very worst outcome, how many more do we need? Well, to get there, are you going to leave Iraq? Are you going to leave or disengage in Syria? Are you going to leave our European allies to their own devices? Those are very serious questions. They drive numbers. But on the whole, would I rather have a somewhat smaller army that is properly man-trained and equipped versus a larger army that is not? I'll take the man-trained and equipped army every day.
Do you think that the Army is going to get as much money as it wants?
Well, I think they're going to do better. And the fortunate thing, guys like me come and go, but the military leadership, the officer corps, and many of the enlisted folks stay around. They know what they've been through over the last 17 years. Virtually all of them volunteered to serve knowing that they would be in harm's way or likely to be in harm's way. So any relief they can get, I'm sure, would be greatly appreciated.
A debate that was going on that you oversaw and has consumed parts of the Army is this sense of what are the capabilities the force should have. There are folks who said that, look, we have to maintain these counterinsurgency capabilities because we are going to keep fighting these kinds of fights no matter where we go. History has shown that. There are those who say, look, that's kind of an aberration and we have to get into the high-intensity fight. General Petraeus always used to point out the operations we were doing in Iraq and Afghanistan were extremely high-intensity combined arms operations. They just might not have been done necessarily in the scale that we've done at the NTC, but it certainly involved the full spectrum of capabilities. As the Army goes into this debate, it looks like Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan are going to be protracted missions. If you look at conflict potentially in the Pacific, it's going to be very different. As you said, there may be interrupted communications, smaller unit operations, much more distributed. As you look out there in the future, what is the right skill set? And for all the people who like to criticize the Army, including some in the Army, because it is a very self-critical service, often in a very positive way, has it got that balance about right, do you think?
I think we're headed in the right direction. The critics do have a point. I mean, as General Milley noted today, with the exception of 2003 in the invasion of Iraq, we have largely been fighting a counterterrorism, counterinsurgency strategy for 17 years. You can't just train to those kinds of very narrow, very important, and often, as General Petraeus suggested, very dangerous environments at the exclusion of everything else. So just before I left the Pentagon, we had begun to revert our combat training center rotations to a more broadly based experience. And again, as General Milley spoke to, I think very eloquently, begun to train a force and train leadership that is more comfortable no matter what the environment may be, meaning you're going into an uncertain circumstance. You may be fighting in this city, or you may be out in the countryside trying to disrupt some organization, some military organization. So you've got to have leaders who can switch that on and off like a switch. The time issue, again, comes up for concern, but I think, as I said, everything's headed in the right direction.
You built an enormous reputation for bipartisanship. When you were up on Congress, you were a Republican, an upstate New York Republican, who then served in a Democratic administration with distinction, and always put party aside when you were doing these jobs. As you look at Congress, as you look at your former colleagues, and you look at some of the acrimony that exists now, to you, what are sort of the keys of bipartisanship? What are there are some folks who are Democrats who are saying there's no way we're going to serve in this administration. I think the last administration did have a lot more Republicans who did cross the aisle and actually serve in it, in part because it was Secretary Gates, but I think maybe the culture was a little bit different. But talk to us a little bit about what you think the keys of bipartisanship are. What advice you have for your fellow colleagues. What do you have advice for folks who may be interested in government and more broadly, about serving in the national interest as opposed to the political interest?
Well, I never criticize anybody for holding their beliefs very passionately, and I think we've certainly seen that on both ends of the political spectrum and both houses, frankly. I'm a big believer in the people get the kind of government that they want, and whether it's an ultra-left member of the House or an ultra-right member of the House, they must be the choice of their district or they wouldn't be here. But I think that, and so I would never ask someone to abandon their principles. But if you look back through history, some of it recent, some across the entire length and life of this nation, you can find a lot of people who are highly principled, who had core beliefs that I think they often wore on their sleeves, but they are able to govern. And I think no matter what you are, you're liberal, conservative, independent, the people back home may want you to vote this way on something, but ultimately they want you to govern. And you see the low approval ratings for Congress. I think that's driven in large measure because there's been a failure to govern because they just can't get the votes. That's what you need in the House, 218, 51, often 60 in the Senate. So you got to talk to everybody and converse amongst yourselves. And if you look at the spending bill that the House has passed, and I hope is signed into law soon, It was actually a bipartisan vote. I had looked at it, in fact, last night, and surprised by some of the no's and equally pleasantly surprised by some of the yeses. So if you can sit down and every member realizes there's no 100% winner here. Yeah, it's a zero-sum game, so you got to give a little to get a little, and it's not any more complicated than that.
Are earmarks, as Jack Murtha used to tell me, one of the best things that ever happened in terms of being able to get folks to get along and actually make deals they might not otherwise make?
Well, I think leadership would probably tell you they are. Without earmarks, I think we've seen an erosion of the leadership's ability to take members where they might not otherwise go. I'll let the philosophical debate continue without me.
Mr. Secretary, thanks. It's always an honor talking to you. Thank you.
Good seeing you.